Yes, Sakshi, it's visible.
Okay, just a moment. I'm just on my way to share my screen. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Sakshi, the member of CYMG, and we are here to uh, the webinar on to road to Busan plastic action webinar series. And we are going to discuss on the webinar on the upstream measures and the binding rules to combat the plastic pollution. And here we are going to have a few of our speakers. So yeah, starting forward, that this is our webinar series, and we are going to have a few of the speakers over here. And the webinar series on the upstream measures and binding rules is the second event in the Road to Busan, the Plastic Action Series. And this webinar is held to discuss the necessity for the legally binding instrument to effectively address the plastic pollution by recognizing and regulating the upstream measures. Even the today's discussion bring us together to address one of the most pressing environmental challenges of our time, and that is the plastic pollution. So today we have Juan Baston, Bethany Almar, and then after we have the Dr. Alexander Harrington, and then Ms. Karuna Rana. After that, we will have Zara Hawkins and then Aston Hawkins. Starting from the very first speaker, Juan Baston and Bethany Almar. Juan is the Spanish researcher in environmental and earth sciences based at the CEARC laboratory, Cultures, Environments, Arctic Representations, Climate in France. He received his doctorate degree and have participated in 9 oceanographic research cruises. Bethany Almers, Dr. Bethany is a professor of ecotoxicology and environmental sciences at the Department of Biology and Environmental Sciences, University of Gothenburg, Sweden. She is also the steering committee member of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. With that note, I'll start handovering the floor to Joanne and Bethany. But before that, I'm really curious to know on these certain aspects that we are discussing on the scientific coalition, as their background is from the scientific coalition. So it is an integral part of the INC itself. And we really know that scientific coalition has certain priorities that instruments should be addressing. So starting with the questions that how does and what does the coalition have in mind in relation to the need to integration of the upstream measures, and posing another question that the need of the ILBI to recognize the entire life cycles of the plastic and not only to the downstream measures. So after this presentation, I'm hoping that Joanna and Bethany will take over these kind of questions. And moving ahead with the Dr. Alexander Harrington, she is the lecturer in law and Lancaster University Law School and chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law Agreement on Plastic Pollution Task Force. She is the director of these studies for the International Law Association of Colombia, International Legal Advisor, University of Silesia, Just Transitions Committee, and sit on the editorial board of multiple academic publications. Even Dr. Harrington has written authored the several books, including the International Organizations and Law, then International Law and Global Governance, then Treaty Regimes and Sustainable Development Goals, Interpretation, Just Transition and Future of Law and Regulation. Even she has also authored The Future of Peace, Incorporation of Intergenerational Equity and Justice in Peace Treaties and Reconciliation Agreements. For that, as I can see her background as from nature of binding rules, and
the reason for happiness or unhappiness is the quality of
and then
what we call
how
social
exactly
capital.
as the instrument can be make this treaty be most
People
effective
have
and possible
networks of
treaty that can be
friends
ratified by the
and
countries
colleagues.
itself.
Do they trust
With
others?
that note, I have another question
Do
for
they
her
trust
to
their government not
answer it
skirting
by
their government
from
growth?
her presentation, that how
Huge
far member states can bound by
people
such legal
reward
binding
their
instruments.
lives to
And
recognize
moving
satisfaction.
ahead with the Ms. Karuna Rana. Ms. Karuna Rana is an award-winning social entrepreneur and environmental activist focused on the tackling plastic pollution and advancing an inclusive, sustainable blue economy in small islands developing states, or rather big ocean states. And she has also the co-founder of SIA, and has also career experience working in the intersection of science, policy, business, and community engagement across multiple organizations and geographies. Moving ahead with Zara Hawkins, she is a 15-year-old seaweed ambassador and the founder of Super Seaweed. At the very young age, she has also co-founded Hidden Plastic alongside her brother Ashton to raise the awareness of the dangers of the lesser-known threat plastic brings. Even Ashton, her brother Hawkins, is 13-year-old at the very early age, a co-founder of the Hidden Plastic. Along with Zara, he attended the second and the fourth Global Plastic Treaty negotiations, where he spoke in the front of the main plenary at the second and was the youngest attendee at the both. Moving ahead and handing over the mic to Joan Baston to kindly proceed with the presentation.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's Bethany who will be starting our presentation. Hello, everyone. And I think you have the slides. So if you can please share the slides, and I just put it full screen if it's possible. Thank you very much. Bethany.
Yeah, thanks, Juan. Hi, everyone. My name is Bethany, and I just want to start by thanking you for the invitation to come and speak here. As you heard, I'm an ecotoxicologist and environmental scientist in Sweden, and I've been doing research on the environmental impacts of plastics for 14 years, but I've been working on chemicals and other kinds of pollution for longer than that. So what we're going to do today, Juan and I are going to take turns talking you through a bit about the Scientist Coalition and our positions on the need for primary plastic production reduction, so upstream measures regulating plastics production. Next slide, please. So to begin with, I wanted to put forth the definition that we've been working with in our group about what plastic is, because this is very important in the framework of the treaty. And in our response to the revised Zero draft, we defined it as such. Plastic materials are made of synthetic and semi-synthetic polymers that are used for the first time to create plastic products in any form. This necessarily includes all thermoplastic, thermoset, elastomer, and composite resins made both from bio-based and fossil fuel-based feedstocks. So there's a lot in there. And what I'd like to point to is a few different things. One, that we include synthetic and semi-synthetic polymers. Some polymers might be naturally occurring, like cellulose or something like this. And just in case you're unaware, a polymer is a chain of molecules that are connected together through chemical reactions. And these are like repeating molecules that are referred to as monomers. So synthetic polymers are made from, they're man-made, they're not natural. And a semi-synthetic polymer might be natural in its base, but it's been chemically altered. So it's no longer completely natural, but rather is semi-synthetic. Then we also talk about primary production, so used for the first time to create plastics products. And this is different from a recycled plastic, for example. And then we're also including both bio-based and fossil fuel-based feedstocks, because the raw materials that can be used to make the monomers and in turn the polymers mostly are from fossil fuels today, 98, 99%, but there are bio-based materials. So some raw materials might come from corn, for example, or sugar or other materials. Okay, starting point. Next slide, please. When we're talking about plastics, again, to help set the scene for the complexity of the issues that we're facing, I have two pictures here. One of them is showing the global and national flows of chemicals and primary plastics products. And it's not at all intended that you should try to understand this image, but rather that it's here to demonstrate how complex the systems are. And these are plagued by low levels of transparency and significant knowledge gaps. So we don't know where the chemicals are, what they're included in. We don't know how they're flowing through our societies, our ecosystems, our technospheres. We don't know where they're ending up. We don't have good knowledge around what is being put into products, and we don't have good knowledge about where it's leaching out or about the environmental impacts. And that brings us to the second image, which is from a report that was released earlier this year called the PlastChem report. And the scientists there were looking at inventories of chemicals that are used and present in plastics. And that number is 16,000. So 16,000 chemicals that might be in plastics products. And we don't necessarily, again, know where or when or how much of them are used. The scientists did find that 4,200 of those 16,000 chemicals have hazardous properties, but that 10,000 lack data. And when we use the word hazardous properties, we're referring to the kinds of impacts that the chemicals can have in living organisms. And this includes properties such as being persistent, that they're long-lived, they don't degrade, they can bioaccumulate in bodies and organisms, they might be toxic through different mechanisms, they can be cancerogenic, they can be mutagenic, they can be reproductively toxic, they can impact hormone systems, they can be toxic to animals or organisms in the aquatic environment, and so on. So a lot of toxic chemicals in a lot of products, and the entire system is very complex and plagued by knowledge gaps and lacks of data. Next slide, please. We're talking about now and addressing this problem. We have to not only understand what plastics are, and I just defined polymers for us, nor the complexity of the system, but understand the full life cycle of plastics. And this is how we're understanding this within the Scientist Coalition, and defining the life cycle of plastics as starting with resource extraction, which, as I said earlier, is mainly fossil fuels, but other bio-based resources as well. And from that stage, you move into polymer production. And this is when the bulk material, the basic polymer backbone of the plastics is made. And this is also a stage where you will start seeing chemicals included from contamination, from reaction products, additives that are used in the plastics materials. And this is moving us into the next stage of product manufacturing. The products themselves will be transported. This is a global system that we're talking about, so a lot of transboundary movement of plastics through trade. Then you come finally into the use phase, and this is both commercial use, industrial use, and consumer use. And a lot of times people might only focus on that little bit right there, consumer use, and not have full knowledge of the rest of the system. And then after the use phase, we have waste management and recycling, and then finally removal and remediation for plastic that is already in the environment. But it's important to know that at every single one of these stages, we have pollution occurring. And that pollution can be the plastics objects themselves, but it can also be chemicals, it can be particles, micro and nanoplastic particles. It can also include greenhouse gases that are being released, among other things. So this entire life cycle is polluting at every stage. Next step, please. Here I have some images showing what some of that might look like. So the first image that looks like the smoke cloud coming up is from a train accident in the United States, where a train derailed carrying vinyl chloride, which is the precursor molecule that is used to make PVC, a plastic that we find a lot in water pipes and things like this. And this is a toxic chemical that was set on fire, and when it burns, it releases even more toxic chemicals called dioxins, and that's what we can see in this picture here, is those chemicals being burned. The image below that is from a beach in Sri Lanka, when a ship that was transporting raw plastics, so nurdles, these small round, actually I have some here on my desk, these little round plastic beads that you might find on beaches around the world. These are the precursors to products. So when the plastic is made and shipped to manufacturers that will use it to make products. This ship had an accident, it caught fire, and millions and millions of particles ended up on the beaches. As you can see here, these people are wading ankle deep in plastics that are partly incinerated. The next picture is more from the use phase. Plastics are commonly used in food packaging materials, but there's a lot of other sectors where they're used in textiles and construction, in food production. So fisheries is one area, agriculture is another. I have paint there because paint is one of the most common sources of microplastics that we're finding in the environment. And the last picture is from a dump site showing textile wastes. And I brought that up too because the majority of textiles today, more than 60%, are made from synthetic materials, a lot of which is plastics. So we have a lot of problems at every life stage of the plastics. Next, please. This is an image summarizing a bit about what we know about the environmental impacts of plastics. And the UN a number of years ago identified what's called the triple planetary crisis. And this is understanding the major threats to humanity, to people, and to human societies from changes that are occurring on the planet. And those three threats are climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And plastics is integral to affecting each of these triple threats. So plastics is connected to climate change through the use of fossil fuels, through emissions of greenhouse gases during production, during sourcing of the raw materials, during incineration. Plastics are also found to have the potential to modify carbon cycling. So carbon storage in the oceans and carbon sequestration in the oceans is a major sink of carbon and important in regulating concentrations in the atmosphere and global climate patterns. And the last example that we have there is impacting albedo. And this is when plastics and particles might be impacting light scattering. We can see this in the Arctic ices, and in more recent scientific studies, we can see it in cloud formation, where plastics are impacting the way that light is absorbed or scattered in our atmosphere. Then we have another example of biodiversity loss, where plastics are important in the spread of non-native or invasive species, but also impacting habitats and leading to habitat destruction. There's also indications that the microbes growing on surfaces of plastics might have different functions and different speciation. And then finally, plastics obviously are important to pollution, and we're finding plastics pollution literally on every part of the planet, in soil, in water, in air, in deep oceans, in human bodies. So the contamination of our planet with plastics is complete. Next slide, please. The next step for moving from the environment is to try to understand the impacts of plastics on human health. And we know quite a lot about the impacts of plastics chemicals on human health. And when I say a lot, I mean about a small number of plastics chemicals, because you remember that there's 16,000 of them, and we don't have data on very many. But for those chemicals that we do understand, we know that humans are exposed via contact with plastics. A lot of that might be, for example, through food contact materials, but there are other exposure routes, toys and textiles and so on, and that these can have impacts on human health. And there are connections to a number of the toxicity mechanisms that I mentioned earlier around cancer and reproductive health, growth and development of children, and so on. So we have a lot of data. Then when it comes to the effects of micro and nanoplastics on humans, that research field is much younger and much newer. There are new studies coming out showing that yes, we are exposed to plastics, and that micro and nanoplastics can be taken up from our lungs maybe, or our gut, or via our skin into our bodies. And it's early days, so it's very new evidence, and we don't really have a good understanding of how much or when and where, or even how it's happening, but that it's happening. And the health impacts of exposure to these particles is also a very new research field. There are some early studies coming out showing that there are connections between, for example, plastics and irritable bowel syndrome or other inflammatory disorders in the gut. But we know a lot from animal studies and from experiments that have been going on for many years in other systems and non-human animals that these particles do have impacts, and they can have negative health impacts on bodies. So this is an emerging field and a growing field of evidence showing us that both the chemicals and the particles are problematic for human health. Next slide, please. But one thing that we were meant to talk about today, and this is where I'm going to pass off to Juan in just a minute, was the importance of upstream solutions. And as I've already demonstrated to you, the plastics life cycle is complex, and pollution is occurring at all of the stages. But if we can move upstream and we can start at the very beginning of that plastics life cycle, we can reduce complexity, we can have better control over the system, And all of the studies that have been done on this question to date show us that we're going to need a lot of solutions to plastic pollution, most definitely, and they will have to come in throughout the entire life cycle. But we cannot solve the plastics pollution problem without upstream measures and without addressing production. And how we understand that a little more, I'm going to pass on to Juan to explain, and then I'll come back towards the end to address one or two more points that I think I'd like to share with you. So muting for a few minutes.
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you, Bethany. So as Bethany said, we are part of the Scientist Coalition, and we are really thankful for the invitation to share with you the effort that we are doing. Can we have the same slides? So I don't know if someone there can share the slides.
Yeah, Juan and I are sharing a slide deck today.
So if you can please bring the PDF back to the screen. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit up, the one before. You can perhaps put on full screen. Like this is more easy to jump from one slide to another.
Is this the one?
Go up. No, it's the previous one, but that's previous. No, you are go up.
Okay.
Previous one. One more.
To the slide where I finished. Okay,
This
then
one.
take the next one after that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that, as Bethany said, that's we realize that all of the efforts that we can do along the life cycle of plastic, it's nothing if we don't focus on the very upstream measures. And so what we realize with the Scientific Coalition. Can you go 2 slides more, please? Pass the second one. Next one, please. And this one. So what we're happy to share with you is what we did previous to Ottawa and what we are doing previous to Busan, because it's important for us to share the process, because we are working as independent scientists. I'm from Versailles University in the same laboratory for the past 15 years, and I'm an environmental scientist, and I do sampling. What it means, I have been sampling shores from Greenland to the Antarctica the past 15 years. And 10 years ago, one colleague, we were in Namibia doing sampling on a beautiful beach, and he told me, but are we doing sampling for the rest of our lives, or we do want to change the things, the plastic pollution? And this question was very important for me because it shifted the way how I saw the problem. And 2 years ago, when the Scientist Coalition started to bring colleagues together, I jumped in super happy to share efforts collectively. And that's what we do for the primary plastic production reduction measure. So in this slide, you can see the names of the 15 colleagues sharing efforts for the past year on this question about how we do reduce plastic production reduction. How we do reduce plastic production reduction seems to be an evidence, but when you look to the narrative in the scientific papers, in the media, in the reports, in the public reports, you will see that the downstream measures catch all of the attention. I will say all the attention for 98% of the efforts, and we have a little effort paying attention to the upstream. So the first thing that we do, and you can go to the next slide, please. And then the next one, because if we have 2 hours presentation, so I will just jump in a slide. The next one, please. So the first thing that we do was to collect all of the data that we have. So meaning all of the peer reviews, because one thing it's important for us in the Scientist Coalition is to work with the evidence-based science. Seems an evidence, but it's not for some of the member states of some of the narratives. So this is the baseline that we have: independent science, free of conflict of interest, and based on evidence-based peer review paper. So what we did is we collect all of the papers, we analyze the key points, the weak points, the baselines, if they mention baselines, targets, etc., etc. And the same we did with the zero draft we got in March last year, in September, sorry, last year, and the revised version, the revised draft that we got in the 28th of December in the 23. So we analyze every single option in the draft, and can you please pass to the next one? And we do the coding of the process. Those are just examples of reports or papers mention primary plastic pollution reduction, etc. So in the next slide, please, you can see the example of the coding that we did. So it means that we dive into the report, to the revised draft, and we analyze every single paragraph, trying to understand from where it comes and what are the consequences. So I go to show you just two examples for this coding in the next slide, please. So you have to imagine that we are 50 colleagues sharing efforts, trying to understand the details of the draft of the treaty that we are working on. So this example, for example, in the part 2.5, the product design, composition of performance. So Francesca De Falco from Plymouth University, one of the colleagues working on this group, what she realized is the reduction is mentioned in the option 1A, 1, 2, and 5, and 3. But she realized that the why was not really addressed. And there's a risk that if we do not address the why, the reduction could be excluded from this provision, since it's not completed in all of the different options. It means that the text of the treaty that we have today, it has a huge and enormous room for evolution prior to Busan. So it's super important that we keep the focus and we continue to stress the narrative we want to propose to the member state and to succeed this treaty. So another example is in the next slide, how the key points, the concepts. You can, next slide, please. So we have used the criteria to follow to implement reduction. And it means that we have to applicate the weight hierarchy and ensure that reduction in the use of all of plastic and prevention of plastic waste, including from non-fossil feedstock, will prevail when considering the development and use of alternative plastic and plastic products. Parties have to address both plastic products produced within its territory and those available on their markets. So we need to have better development of guidelines, standards, and certification, and so on and so forth. So we continue to do the coding, and at the very, so we can jump 2 slides, and we have one with colors. The next one, please. Another one. This one. So after hours and weeks and months of effort, we arrive to very simple idea, what is reflected here. If we want to reduce plastic pollution, we need to reduce plastic production. And how we do reduce plastic production? By reducing the non-essential plastics, by reducing the unsafe and unsustainable plastics, increasing the transparency and the responsibility at the production level, improving the compliance mechanism, and being inspired by sectoral precedents, so by examples that we have in some sectors. So, and this we can apply to the human and to the environmental health. And as very last slide, please, the next one. So we have been working on qualitative, that's the previous slide, and in the quantitative measure that we can unlevel. So this is where we are today. We realized 6 months ago that even if we reduce plastic, let's say by 1%, 2%, or 3% per year, the pollution will continue to increase because plastic is a cumulative product, so we will remain in the environment. Our human health will be still exposed to this to the plastic. So it's super important we have high ambition reduction at the production level. So this curve, that what it shows, that even if we reduce by 10% per year, or between 1 or 3% per year, that's the range that you can see on the right of the image, the cumulative plastic production will reach 20,000 million metric tons by 2040. And this is correlated with the 40-40 narrative that you hear. It comes from the Environmental International Agency. That it's, but this 40%, sorry, till 2040, it means that we reduce 2.6% per year. And this only includes climate change concerns. And as Bethany said, we are facing a triple planetary crisis, so we really need to reduce as much as we can. So in the road to Busan, what we did to follow on this work is we split the effort in three subgroups. One is led by Jane Munke and Christian Sieber on sustainability levels of production. What are the sustainability levels that we can expect or we asking for? So the second group are focusing on PP targets and in the legally binding PP targets. This one led by Tara and Niels. And the third group is on the reduction upstream versus downstream measures. And this one is led by Doris Knobloch from Berlin. So this is how we work. It's strongly collectively in transparent way. I'm super happy to share here the work that we are doing with you. So Bethany, I'll let you the floor in the next slide to please close.
There's another issue that I wanted to raise before we go to Busan. You can take the next slide, please. And that is this, conflicts of interest. So as scientists, we're working, as Juan was also describing, to understand the problems that we're facing. And if we can properly understand the problems that we're facing, then we can find effective solutions. Incorrectly describing the problems will lead us to ineffective or incorrect solutions. And there's an issue around conflicts of interest in the treaty space. This exists also in other spaces around chemicals and products. And what a conflict of interest is when a party that has vested interests is exerting undue influence over outcomes. And something like this would be a company that has economic interests in continuing to produce plastics from fossil fuels. And we're finding that these kinds of actors with vested interests are using techniques that have been used for many decades now around chemicals, around tobacco, around fossil fuels, around climate, around pesticides, but they're doing it in the plastic space now. And what they're doing is trying to create doubt or trying to create confusion or giving false solutions based on misinformation. And these actors might be the industry representatives themselves or lobbyists. We know that there are quite a large number of lobbyists attending the meetings. There might also be countries that are taking different positions, and I'm sure all of you are aware of the fact that there are countries that have that are in support of reducing production, while others maybe only want to focus on waste management. So we're seeing a problem with spreading of misinformation, of cherry picking data, of presentation of very biased studies that might be funded by industry and people that do have vested interests. And there's also actions to try to discredit existing scientific studies or to undermine the credibility of individual scientists. And this is a problem. So we're really trying to push for openness in decision making and for the use of evidence and information that is robust and independent and free of conflicts of interest. This will be very important as we try to find the right solutions to the problems that we're understanding. We would like to see policies on conflicts of interest included into the treaty going forward so that the future science policy interface and the expert bodies that are advising the treaty process will have this in place and ensure evidence-based decision making. Next slide, please. And I think we'll just finish off there by saying that we do see the need for, if you can scroll down one slide, that would be great. Globally binding primary plastic polymer reduction targets, and these need to be connected to mandatory globally binding national targets. We need to reduce the overall volumes that are being produced, but also the complexity of the plastics. So something like chemical simplification, reducing that number of chemicals and then the kinds of polymers we have on the market and the products we have on the market to something simpler and more manageable. The treaty needs to have targets to stop growth, and these need to be, again, connected to legally binding national reduction targets. This will require financial and technical support, so that also needs to be included in the treaty in Busan. There needs to be mechanisms to follow the science as it evolves, because it will, and there will be changes in our understanding of essentiality as we see changes in technologies and infrastructure and systems. So we need mechanisms to evaluate the targets that are in the treaty and to be able to update them and progress towards them. We need to evaluate the effectivity of the treaty itself and be able to be reactive to new situations. And we need to make sure that we're building the treaty on safety, sustainability, essentiality, and transparency criteria that need to be described in the treaty so that we know that we're doing things right and we're protecting the environment and we're protecting people. And next slide. And I think that's our final slide, just finishing by saying that we need to do this. This is the time that we have to do this, and we need to do this now. This photograph is from an artist named Ben Van Wan, who's really, his work really clearly depicts the need to go to the source of the problem, to the production of the problem, and to, as has been said before, turn off the tap. So I will finish there. And on behalf of myself and Juan and the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, thank you for the invitation, for your time, and we're happy to answer questions if there are any, if there's time later.
Thank you so much, Bethany and Joanne. It's really great to hear from you, because it was really an insightful session from your side, and the presentation as well. Moving ahead with obviously we will take over the questions later on, after all of the presentation will be over, so that we will take it on in the end. And then we are moving ahead with Dr. Alexandra Harrington. Now I'll hand over the mic to her.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure if there was going to be a substitution with Karuna, but thank you very much. So lovely to see you all today and see some old friends or friends from various INCs. So lovely to see some of you, and especially our previous speakers. Great to hear from you. Let me try to share my screen, and as always, we'll see if after years of pandemic work, it works. It seems like it does, so there's that. So I will make this the full screen option, and then we'll go from there. So what I would like to do today is just have a bit of a discussion with you about, now that we are leading up to Busan, and hopefully we'll have a treaty text, and certainly we have the compilation document, which is a draft of a treaty text at this point. An understanding of what the treaty will do theoretically and practically, potentially, in terms of both hard law and binding law, and also soft law. Because I know this can be quite difficult. It can be quite hard even for many well-established lawyers to know what the difference is and what the different terms mean, and kind of how to handle the text in the treaty draft that we have. So the compilation document, which is the latest document, but also we've seen the same thing in the revised zero draft as well, because it is something where we have a lot of different potentially conflicting elements going together. So if there are any questions, obviously please let me know, and also please, this is my email, feel free if you have questions or comments later on, always feel free to to get in touch, or even if you're just planning to be in Busan, to keep in touch. So the first thing, just to clarify, because I know it's very confusing for many people, is the idea of binding law and soft law in international law, and how this works, how we've seen this work, what examples we have coming to us from other international arenas. So the first question is, what is binding international law? And there is amongst many people a bit of a confusion and a sense that international law is all soft law, which is not true. There is indeed binding international law. And binding international law comes in treaties. And typically treaties are a mix. They're not one or the other. They're typically a mix of both. But binding international law provisions are the provisions where we see states being obliged to do something or making a commitment to do something. And we can typically see this triggered by language. So if you're reading through, for example, the compilation document, if you're reading through and you see language using words like shall or must, these are kind of triggers to tell you that this is a proposed element that would be binding. So these words don't really leave much room for interpretation. These are words that create an obligation, a positive or negative, depending on what the undertaking is, obligation on a state to either do something or not to do something. And sometimes people say that this is soft in the sense that we don't have an international court that we can go to the same extent that we do in a domestic court context or domestic legal context. However, these are still binding legal commitments that countries undertake. And once they sign on to them, once a country signs a treaty and then ratifies it at home, which means it becomes legally bound to it as a matter of its national law, then it is obliged to put those particular provisions in place. And if it doesn't, whatever the compliance and oversight mechanism that is established for the treaty can be triggered to potentially have findings, negative findings or suggestions, etc., issued against the country, no matter what the issue might be, depending on what the allowance is in the treaty itself. Also, it should be remembered that a lot of the compliance elements from binding aspects of law as well as soft law come from the key connections between, for example, funding from international banks, funding from multilateral institutions, funding from even overseas development authority, etc., assistance and aid is all dependent on, in the various contexts, meeting binding legal obligations and treaties. So there are many aspects where meeting these are quite critical. When we think conversely about soft law in international law, generally, we think about things that states say they would like to do, or they make a commitment to try to do, or a pledge to try to do, but they are not obligated to do this. And so when you're reading through a treaty text, again, if looking at the compilation document, words like may or should, or agree to undertake, or agree to encourage, things like that. These are all much more general. They are all softer, and they don't create the hard commitments. Now, they're often used by some states because they want to soften a bit of the obligations and make them not as onerous and not as binding. But they're also often used in situations where we may have emerging understandings. We may have emerging understandings of what scientific elements are. We may have emerging understandings of what alternatives may be in the plastics context, etc. And so we don't want to build a treaty that would be so rigid that it wouldn't allow for any space in order for the development of additional ideas or additional terms or annexes or decisions of the conferences of the parties in the future, which might be quite valuable to the overall purpose and scope of the treaty, but could potentially be circumscribed if everything is purely binding. So that's why we usually see a mix of both binding law and soft law in a treaty itself. And when we think about this in other international treaty laws, what may often be useful in this context, because we are talking about a multilateral environmental agreement, we're also talking about something that is seeking to address plastic pollution, is to look at, for example, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, because they are very good examples of the blending of both binding law and soft law into a treaty. Also, if you look at things like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Minamata Convention, most of our standard MEAs, they all do reflect this blend between binding law and soft law obligations. So I wanted you to have an understanding of this, to know that it is not unusual for both to be present in treaty systems. What is a bit tricky for us now, as we think about the compilation document, all 77 pages of it, is that we have proposals for both binding and or soft law measures that relate to many of the same topics. And where we find this most consistently, and where we find that this is a big kind of clash of ideas and potentials for what the treaty will look like, is in part 2 of the compilation document, which is also the same part 2 that we had from the zero draft and then revised zero draft onwards. So for those of you who are familiar with this document or the previous iterations of the document, this is where we have what we would call the control measures. So the core elements, the core obligations that state parties will agree to or potentially not agree to in terms of what they are going to do or not do or reduce or pledge to eliminate, etc., as part of their obligations under the treaty. So for this reason, we see at this point a number of different options. And we see that binding law in the definitions of primary plastic polymers, et cetera, to the extent that we have them, but also in the definition of their regulation, has been one option. And then we also see, as will be discussed later on, that it also has been a soft law option. And so we have a number of different ways of looking at this treaty. And we have a number of different ways of looking at the core elements of this treaty. And why does it matter? Often I have a very practical question. If we're trying to have a treaty, oh, I think someone has a live mic. There's a very practical question that is often asked me, which is, if we're trying to regulate plastics and plastic pollution, why do we care, or why does it matter if it is in the form of binding or soft law, as long as it is in a treaty document? And obviously the answer is that it is much more difficult to enforce and to get states to comply with something that is a soft law requirement, especially if we're talking about a producer state, or if we're talking about a state that is involved in the life cycle of production and consumption of plastics, where there might not be as much of a benefit to adopt measures that would cut back on obligations or cut back on production and increase obligations on producers, if these are soft law elements. So by deciding whether they're binding or soft law elements, we're actually really saying a great deal about what the intent of the treaty is and how much states will be committing to under the treaty, which is a very important thing, not only for the states, but also for all of us, as those of us involved in treaty negotiations and the treaty process, but also for those of us as consumers, and especially for the younger generations out there who will continue to be facing the problems of plastic pollution. So it really is quite a big and important difference as to whether we think of any of the things on this list here, for example, primary plastic polymers, chemicals of concern, problematic and avoidable plastics, product design, the things that we saw argued about in Bangkok and without a great deal of success in final determinations, also in the future being something that will weigh heavily on how we address plastic and plastic pollution as a matter of legal obligation and as a matter of what the burdens that are passed on to all of you and your children, et cetera, might be. Other areas where we see a proposal for binding law is the idea of extended producer responsibility. Now, this has been a bit of a challenge because we don't necessarily have a definition of what extended producer responsibility is. And so without that definition, it is often quite hard to determine whether it should be binding law or soft law. And different countries that have extended producer responsibility laws have their own national definitions. They also have their own national standards. So it's useful to look at those, but it's a bit difficult to say we should make them either binding or soft law kind of basis for the treaty when they are different legal systems. Let's see, there we are. When we're also talking about other examples, essentially most of part 2 has a binding law proposal at this point. So things like emissions and releases throughout the plastic life cycle, which also gets into leakage, et cetera, could potentially be quite a strong provision or set of provisions, in that it could have binding law that would be very restrictive on states. And much of this also would not only be restrictive on states, but it would also be restrictive on states in terms of their regulation of corporate actors. So this would require much more proactive elements for various corporate entities and actors than a soft law element would. The same is true in waste management. Fishing gear obviously is something that is still a bit up in the air, and so it has this kind of odd designation of its lettering, its numbering. But again, we see many different aspects that would be either voluntary or mandatory, so either binding or soft law. And trade in particular is one where we see an emphasis more on having binding law. So the proposals for having things like import and export licenses, et cetera, are much more already on the idea of binding law. And a lot of this is based on the fact that they are indeed modeled on additional protocols from other MEAs that already exist. So from Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, and the CBD, et cetera. I don't want to take too long because I am conscious that we're already going over time. So I would just highlight that in addition to part 2, where we have a number of different conflicts between the potentials for binding or soft law to be used and the different meanings that that has, we also have conflicting elements in terms of whether the financing mechanisms would be binding in terms of contributions or soft law, so voluntary in terms of contributions from states that would be potentially contributing states. We also see this tension in the idea of capacity building and technological transfer and assistance and technology generally, all coming out of part 3. And then in part 4, we also see this type of tension between whether these would be binding obligations or soft law obligations under both National Action Plan reporting systems. So whether states would have obligations that they would have to submit reports periodically in the form of national action plans or reporting on progress, as we see in other treaty regimes in many other MEAs.
Okay, yeah,
Or
you
whether
did just
this
send me
would
a
be a
pin,
voluntary entity, involuntary activity that would be done at the discretion of states. And again, giving them a lot more leeway. The benefit of this, obviously, is that states have a bit more leeway. The downside to this is that it makes it very difficult to then determine whether states are meeting their obligations and to come up with any holistic understanding of where a treaty is in 5 or 10 years based on a comprehensive overview, such as we saw from the global stocktake from the UNFCCC context. So the rest of my slides were just looking at where soft law is, and I think I just wanted to bridge over binding and soft law together because many of them are in the same points. I don't want to take any extra time, but I will be happy to stop sharing my screen now. And encourage you all to ask questions either now or to ask questions later on, email, as you will. And for those of you who are going to Busan, please do stay in touch. I think it's really important that we all talk together, and as questions arise, just let each other know. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harrington. Understanding this basic understanding from the binding rules to understanding the legal frameworks in more legal terms is really crucial, and we really move forward to shaping this treaty. And hopefully we will be soon meeting you there. And now moving forward with Ms. Karuna Rana. Those who have joined late, just to make them understand that she is the social entrepreneur and the environmental activist. And moving forward to the Ms. Karuna Rana.
Hi, everyone. I'm just sharing my screen, so I think you can see it now. Yes, okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure that this is working. Okay, so hi, everyone, and it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this very important conversation. And I think it's perfect to have heard from Bethany and Juan from on a more scientific perspective of dealing with upstream measures. and Alexandra talked about the legal aspect. So after science and legal, what I'm going to be bringing is more of a community perspective, specifically community-led actions on upstream measures, but also our take on dealing with plastic pollution from a small island state perspective. I am, I have the opportunity to introduce myself once again, and especially BOSSI, the Big Ocean States Initiative, which is a newly launched initiative, which is focused on elevating the representation and leadership of people from big ocean states, as well as closing the blue funding gap for the very same big ocean states. And what are big ocean states? I always love to start my presentation with exactly that. I'm trying to move the screen and oops, yes. Okay, so big ocean states are actually small island developing states as we've always known them, but it's very important to remember that small island states collectively control 30% of the world's oceans and seas. In terms of land size as well as ocean size, it is very clear that these very small island developing states is actually big ocean states. So we are changing the narrative, and this is a very important narrative to own and change, because this not only influences the leadership of small island states in the ocean space, but it also influences them in conversations that are relevant to the ocean, for example, plastic pollution. So moving forward, I wanted to just quickly get this out of the way, but moving forward, we'll be referring to SIDS as big ocean states or BOSS, and BOSS also because we prefer big ocean states, BOSS, rather than large ocean states, which is LOSS. BOSS sounds cooler. All right, so before I delve into the work that I have been doing, I wanted to quickly talk about why it's important to look at plastic pollution, and especially upstream measures, differently when we talk about these very big ocean states. They are very unique in their circumstances. Firstly, geography, as we all know, their geographical remoteness and small land mass comes with logistical challenges, whether it's in the way they have to transport between the different islands, but also in terms of infrastructure, and especially when we talk of small land mass, which is the next one. Most of these big ocean states lack economies of scale, as well as waste management and industry infrastructure. And that also comes with another problem, that is reliance on imports. Big ocean states are heavily import dependent for food and other resources. And this also makes them a passive importer of plastic packaging. So very often they're not able to control what kind of plastic packaging is entering the country, because that comes automatically with the food that is being imported, as well as other materials. There is also the problem of economic resources. There is a need for a big initial investment for refill and reuse systems, for instance, that could be very high for a lot of these big ocean states. And especially when we think of consumer affordability, a lot of the solutions that are proposed come at a cost, and we often assume that people, will have the opportunity to go and take their trash into a recycling center. For example, in Mauritius, we don't have waste segregation at home. So we think that, people will be able to do that, but a lot of people who don't have cars won't be able to do it. Similarly, with refill and reuse systems, we don't have that in a lot of the supermarkets, and we have that only in certain areas, and very often these areas are more tourist focused or expat focused, rather than Mauritians themselves, and locals would not even go there. So there is that also to keep in mind. And finally, big ocean states stay vulnerable to climate change related impacts, such as storms and floods that can damage infrastructure, making it more difficult to implement and maintain sustainable practices, both upstream and downstream. And we actually saw that earlier this year in Mauritius, when we had a heavy flash flooding in the capital, which happens quite often. And when that happens, we often find all the waste that is in the ocean or in the water, from the bins and on land, they all come up, and they all, it's all filled into one spot. For example, we have a waterfront that was not practically open for anyone. It was It was closed for 2 days because it was full of plastic waste. So these are some of the challenges. I want to now talk about some of the projects that I have led and been part of within big ocean states for us to understand what are some of the challenges when it comes to implementing such projects. One of them was the tap water revolution that we had worked on a few years ago in Mauritius. And the reason being, we wanted to reduce the use of plastics. And we thought of PD bottles, which is very big. In Mauritius, 100 million PD bottles come into the market every year. So we thought of, we were like, what is an easy way? What would be a low-hanging fruit to tackle this? And water was easy to, water came to mind as a first thing, only because in Mauritius, tap water is portable, which is still a privilege for Mauritius. Not a lot of the other big ocean states might not necessarily have tap water that is portable. But despite having tap water that is portable, in our culture, we don't have drinking water fountains, nor can we go to restaurants and hotels and ask for free tap water. This doesn't exist. You have to buy bottled water at a restaurant or at a hotel. So what we did is had this project where we ran campaigns on having people to drink more of the tap water and less of the bottled water. We even took the initiative of installing drinking water fountains in some public places, which were we were the first ones to do that. And we also talked to governments to learn what are some of the challenges. We conducted cleanups as a way to gather data. For example, we found out cigarette butts are some of the biggest polluters, but not everyone is working on that. It often goes unnoticed, especially on the beaches. And we also set up a young tap water ambassadors program where we had young people trained to go and talk to hotels and restaurants to convince them to provide safe tap water as an option. And as a result, we have more drinking water fountains, for example, in our tram stations. We have a big group of hotels that has implemented that in all of their resorts. So there have been some successes, but while these are, very good successes, we've also had some challenges because of how, tap water is viewed. It's literally a cultural and behavioral change that we're talking about. And it's bringing your reusable water bottle with you every time you leave the house. A lot of people don't, think to do that. And when we installed the drinking water fountains in public places, one of the things we learned was that it also needed to be maintained. So there were certain places where it was installed and it was used for 1 or 2 years, but it was not properly maintained by the authorities there, so they had to remove it. So it is a bit of a long journey, but this is this is one of the big learnings we've had when we worked on that project. And we wanted to implement this in some of the other islands in the Indian Ocean, but as I mentioned in the beginning, not every island has potable tap water. So we're still thinking of how can we implement a project like that there. It would probably mean installing drinking water fountains with a filter attached, or asking more people to install filters in their house or boil water, which a lot of people still feel is very cumbersome and would rather go to bottled water. So that's one of the projects we had worked on. And I also wanted to share pictures of the campaign that we had run. We had young people actually scuba dive with messages like these. And it was really exciting because these ambassadors were not only trained to do campaigns like these, but actually talk to institutions. I also wanted to, speaking of cleanups, it's very important to also share these pictures, and a cleanup that Bossy collaborated with Sauve la Nature, which is a youth-led NGO in Mauritius. So they organized a cleanup with around 50 volunteers. We talked to them because we wanted to not just help them with the cleanup, but we wanted to audit the waste. So very often we view cleanups as a downstream measure or something that is just on the surface, but it's a powerful tool if you can gather data in terms of learning what are some of the biggest polluters, what are the biggest type of plastics that end up in the environment, and sometimes also who are the biggest brands. And that was also a big learning. So when we did that, obviously PD bottles were the biggest ones, but HDPE was second in line. And very often PET bottles, because of their high recyclability, are the ones that, we think of when we're talking about recycling systems. I know we're talking about upstream measures, but these data are also important to consider when we're talking of not just downstream measures, but also upstream measures, to understand that we also need to look at HDPE as one of the biggest plastic polluters. And I also wanted to quickly talk about plastic substitutes. This is part of the research that I had been involved in. Actually, led this research in 2020, and it's something that I'm still working on because we want to do that for a lot more plastic substitutes. But basically, we wanted to compare a plastic straw versus a PLA and paper straw in terms of the life cycle of these. And we found out that PLA and paper had a higher carbon footprint, a higher energy use, sometimes 2 to 3 times more than plastic themselves. It's not to say that, this means that we should go back to plastic, but this was an important learning for us to understand that just because we have a problem with a plastic item, we quickly go to replacing it with another material without thinking of the life cycle approach. And this is especially important for plastic straws because it is an avoidable plastic, or something that could be straw upon request is actually not the case. And we get a plastic straw in our drink whether we want it or not in a lot of restaurants. And, just as, if we just ban the plastic straws and just replace them with paper or PLA or something else, and don't use the straw upon request policy to go with it, that would mean that PLA or paper or any other type of straw would continue coming into our drink. So it's also important to look at a product, look at reduction from a product perspective rather than just a plastic perspective. Now, based on these, I wanted to share some of the things that I feel needs to happen to increase the effective implementation of upstream measures, I would say in the global south, but specifically in big ocean states. Obviously, reduction first. It's the rule of waste hierarchy that it's always reduction first. So it's important to assess commonly used plastics so that we can eliminate the non-essential and problematic ones. And this is very often not done. I know now a lot of governments are doing this, and they are working on roadmaps. And the first step of working on a roadmap is actually to take stock of what is being used, what's on the market. And in the case of big ocean states, what are we importing? So that's key. That's a very key data point and a very important starting point. Decolonization, we very often don't link that to some of the measures we talk about, whether it's in the ocean space or in the plastic pollution space. But this is something that at Bossy we are very passionate about. And this is important in this narrative, which is we really want to shift away from some of the Western-centric solutions to tackling plastic pollutions to more of the locally relevant narratives and solutions that use traditional and cultural approaches. I'm sure we all know, if we're from an island or from the global south, that traditionally we have used things like banana leaves or bamboo and hand woven bags and whatnot in the past, and these sometimes are appropriated by the Western culture without giving credit where it's due. But also we tend to import solutions from the West, which we think would be applicable to these islands. And very often they're not, because we do come from a different culture. So it's important to keep that in mind. And this also links to resource equity. A decolonized approach would also mean that funding and resources for addressing plastic pollution has to flow equitably to countries that need them the most. And this is also important when we talk of innovation and innovation when it comes to plastic substitutes, because that's an area I have worked on. And one of the plastic substitutes that I have been very passionate about is seaweed-based plastic substitutes and seaweed-based materials. And I've noticed that it's having seen and worked with startups that make seaweed-based materials from the global north and the global south, you can see a vast difference, because in the global north they have so much more access to funding. So they're given investment to prototype and to fail, and fail again, but continue working on it. And they reach the market faster. Whereas I know people from, Mauritius and Seychelles who have been working on this for years, but they're still stuck because they don't have that level of funding and technical expertise. And this is also something that we need to focus on. Life cycle approach, I mean, we've heard that from the Scientist Coalition. We need to have a life cycle approach, but this is also important when we are talking of plastic substitutes, especially when designing policy, and that is linked to the research that I suggested. And then it's a waste management infrastructure that we should also be investing in, and that can handle compostable alternatives. One of the things that I haven't seen focus on when it comes to the plastics treaty is composting, because as an upstream measure, after we have reduced, and there will be some that we can't reduce nor we can reuse or refill, then we are going to look at alternatives, and we're going to be looking at compostable alternatives. And that's what's happening in Mauritius and many of the islands nearby. And we all know, I mean, a lot of the experts would agree with me that a lot of the compostables are not actually compostable, except when they are given industrial composting infrastructure. So just because you're using a compostable spoon or a fork, you can't assume that, this will biodegrade in the environment or in your home compost. That is not necessarily the case, but that is what is being said, at least in Mauritius, whether I want it or not, I see a lot of compostable alternatives around me, and I'm pretty sure a lot of them are coming from PLA and whatnot, and they're not going to be compostable in the real environment. So in a lot of the global north countries, we don't have that level of industrial composting infrastructure. So imagine what would be the case in the islands. So that's something we should start to think about as well. And finally, climate justice. It's very important to remember that plastics are derived from fossil fuels and contribute to climate change throughout their life cycle. And island communities are on the front line of both plastic pollution and climate change. So their voices have to be the strongest. And when I say their voices, it's not just voices in negotiations, but also voices when we think of solutions that should be implemented. I've been in rooms where a lot of the solutions that are being discussed are coming from international organizations, from consultancies and whatnot that are from the global north. But again, I would say let's go back to the experts that we have on the ground and hear from them and center them in all the conversations that we have. But also remember that plastic pollution has a strong space, not just in the plastics treaty, but also in the climate change negotiations and the ocean, of course. So I'm going to stop here because I am actually running out of time. I have another commitment. I apologize for that. I won't be able to stay for any questions, but I am providing you my email address here, which I will also share in the chat. And please feel free to get in touch if you want to discuss how we can work together or if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karuna. I really appreciate your perspectives, because the very, very, very fascinating thing and the very reality check that I have understood from your presentation is the comparative analysis of the drinking straw. And the entire presentation was very insightful and enriching, highlighting the how approaches to increase the effective implementation of the upstream measures, and then after coming forward to the practical complexities of the integrating policies. And with that, I am finally going to announce Zara and Aston Hawkins. Let's hear from the two young and passionate advocates for combating the plastic pollution. And over to Zara.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Is it possible to share screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, thank you. Seaweed, an upstream solution to single-use plastics. Hello, I'm Zara. I'm 15 years old and the co-founder of Hidden Plastic, which I started alongside my brother Ashton, who'll be speaking later today. And we had the opportunity to attend INC 2 and 4 as some of the only under 18s present at both. I'm also the founder of the organization Super Seaweed. So, with the final INC set for later this year, and for the treaty text to hopefully be ratified next year, there will, fingers crossed, be at least a partial ban on single-use plastics, because we need to turn off the tap on plastic production. But it would be impossible to ban single-use plastics without a suitable alternative to take its place. And unfortunately, PLAs and the traditional bioplastics are not quite the solution we all hope for, as Karina mentioned earlier. Even though they are industrially compostable, in certain facilities, if they were to end up in the ocean, they would still behave like normal plastics. So we really need a plastic alternative that is fully compostable, and if it were to end up in the ocean, would completely disappear. But does such material even exist? Well, the answer is yes, and it originates from the ocean itself. That's right, seaweed. There are now many startups starting to create materials that behave like plastic when in use, but at the end of life, decompose fully, just like a plant. Here's some of the companies, and you can see some of their products. But I'll go into more depth on Notpla, who is an Earthshot Prize winner, and they specialize in the linings of cardboard boxes, which are often lined as an oil barrier with either plastic or forever chemicals. So it's really exciting that they've cracked it and you can use seaweed instead. They've also started creating rigid materials, such as this cutlery, which are currently in the prototype stage of development. But they already have some products that are already on the market today. Another company, oh, and don't just take it from me, Notpla was the first and only material to be recognized as plastic-free by the Dutch government in 2023. Another company is Bezios, which create plastic-like trays that are also fully home compostable and films. And their products are injection moldable, which means that they can be used in legacy machinery like plastics are. But it's not just the end of life that's exciting about seaweed. It's the entire supply chain. Because seaweed grows sustainably. That's because it requires no fresh water or terrestrial land to grow, filters the water it's grown in, which mitigates ocean acidification and nitrate and phosphate runoff, and could potentially capture 20 times as much carbon as a rainforest of the equivalent size. So that all sounds almost too good to be true. So here's a few of the current downsides. The effects of climate change impact cultivation. Warming waters make it harder for cold water seaweeds to grow, forcing them ocean farmers to resort to deeper and harder to access waters. And in some places, the farmed seaweeds are invasive, which means that the seaweeds in demand to be used for seaweed materials can't be grown everywhere. In relation to plastic, seaweed materials are still a lot more expensive. But then, in comparison to, if you factor in plastic subsidies, the cost balances out a bit more. And compared to seaweed's potential, these are all minor issues that can be overcome in the years to come. And again, these materials are fully compostable, and in some cases, even edible. And compared to the true cost of plastic, this is an opportunity that we can't miss. So, it is important that the Global Plastics Treaty leaves space for innovations like this and has funding opportunities for real solutions. So, if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. You can find me below. And some more information on seed materials on Super Seaweed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zara. And it's really truly inspiring to hear from such a passionate young leader. And moving ahead to Aston Hawkins.
Can I share my screen? Keynote. Okay. Well, hello. I am Ashton. As Zara did a pretty good introduction. So the clean drinking water myth and how decreasing demand can stop waste upstream in Maldives and other SIDS, or the BOSS. So, there is this myth with plastic that somehow drinking water out of a plastic bottle is better. And there is in a few countries that don't have proper water supplies, but actually in the majority of them, it's actually better to drink water from it because there isn't the leaching of the microplastics into the water, which has a whole host of health problems. And so, this is the Maldives. They're a small island nation, and they have a population of like 500,000. So they're quite small. And in the 90s, big plastic companies came in and started to advertise saying their water was better than what they get out of the tap. And so now they are a nation addicted to plastic bottles. And here's the thing about the Maldives. They are a small island developing nation. They only have 1% of land that is their country. 99% is water. So they don't have anywhere to put their rubbish. So what they do is they just dump it in a big pile on an island called Tilafushi, where it's been openly burning for the past few decades. Non-stop fire burning the rubbish. And this has a ton of problems, like sometimes the plastic's even leaching to the ocean, which also is no surprise that the Maldives has the worst microplastic polluted water of any country in the entire world. And this is a big problem because also the Maldives is home to a lot of filter feeders like manta rays and whale sharks that are just eating this plastic. But we have been working on a solution to this with the artist Alexander Hamilton from Distillinois Studios, which is to put in water refill stations in the country's capital, Male. And these water refill stations use reverse osmosis technology to get water that might not be safe to drink and filter it to the purest form. So these things can filter 165 liters an hour. That's fine. I get. Wait. Oh God. Wait, hold up. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, Aston, we can see the screen, but can you make it to the full screen because it's the slides
Oh,
numbers are
okay.
visible. Yeah.
Oh, wait. Oh, okay. Oh, oh dear. Okay, can you see my screen
Yeah, we can see your
again?
screen. Just make it to the presentation mode. Just play the button.
Wait, hold up.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see it now?
No.
Oh, oh dear. Okay, we'll have to do it like this.
Just remove the thumbnail, then it will be better.
Remove the what?
Yeah, the thumbnail, the left side of the 67%, you can just click on
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, it will be removed. Just show it in the full mode. Yeah, that works.
So anyway, where was I? Okay. So we are working with Distal Illinois Studios and their Maker's Place in the Maldives to have these water refill stations. And oh crap, how do I okay. With the Maker's Place in the Maldives to create these water refill stations out of recycled cans. And hopefully this will prevent the need of plastic bottles in a large amount in the Maldives, in the capital, giving everyone in the capital, Male, within 500 meters access to clean drinking water, because so far all of their water comes in plastic bottles. And hopefully there is a brighter future for the plastic in the Maldives. Wait. Okay, thank you.
I guess there are certain technical issues from Aston's part. Yeah, he will be back soon.
Yeah, it's fine. Apologies for the technical delays. Ashton's we've got some really bad internet at the moment, which is why the screen was acting up. Thank you very much.
Meanwhile, if you have any question to our previous speakers, then we can take over. So if any of you have any questions related to Joan, related to Dr. Alexandra, related to Dr. Bethany, then please go ahead. there are a few more minutes to wait, because Aston will take a few more minutes to rectify his mistakes. Yeah. As I can see, one question from Benson Rian. If any of the speakers can come forward to answer the question of what are the standpoints regarding support in plastic waste management during an upscale major events, such as the Olympics or any major event prompting mass gathering, leading to increase in plastic waste generation. I'd request the speakers. Okay, Aston has already. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I can have a partial answer to this question. I think it's clear the question that drives the point downstream, what is already too late. I want to say that I think it's a non-solution question there for the Olympic Games, even in waste management or in products that we use in the sport. I think in the artificial grass, etc., we, as Bethany said before, we know now today that we have a lot of toxins in there and there's a lot of hazards there. So we have really to increase the reduction again and again in the upstream. So addressing the question of trying to bring the focus on the waste management, it's already, I want to say it's already too late. And I want to say thank you, because really it was an honor to be here. I have to jump, but I know that Bethany is around, another colleague. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Bethany.
Yeah, I just wanted to build a little bit on what Juan said, and waste management, as we've been talking about today, is downstream and not a solution. And we've also heard from some of the previous speakers that in some situations we don't have the infrastructure to provide drinking water, for example. I know that the Olympics did put big efforts into putting like water fountains around the city, so that would be more accessible and people could use reusable systems. But there's a risk in these kinds of events or big campaigns taking opportunities to greenwash. I know like large Olympic scale events are sometimes sponsored by companies like Coca-Cola that are some of the world's biggest polluters, and it's a way for them to buy goodwill to say that they're recycling. But there is also problems with waste exports and really understanding what happens with the waste once it is collected at an event like this and where it ends up. So there's a lack of transparency and there's a risk of greenwashing around the event itself, in addition to the large scale waste generation that's associated with the event. So a few red flags.
Thank you so much for this answer. I really appreciate that. Even one question for you from my side, because as I was going through with your presentation and when you said that, so even what does the coalition have in relation to the evidence of need to integration to the upstream measures? Because yeah, this is the first question that I want to ask. And as the part of the ILBI, what is the need for ILBI to recognize the entire life cycles of the plastics and not only the downstream measures?
These are good questions, and I will, when I'm finished talking, put a link into the chat linking to the Scientist Coalition link tree, where we have a lot of our outputs. So we've been trying to produce fact sheets and policy briefs around the science and the questions around plastics and what needs to be in the treaty. So I'll link to that soon. But regarding your question, so the science does tell us that we need to work upstream, and this is the science connected to planetary function and how the extreme amounts of extractive practices and waste production are essentially destabilizing planetary function and increasing risks and decreasing the habitability of, if you will, of the planet, the safe operating space for humanity on the planet, causing harms to humans and to societies and to economies. It's not sustainable from an environmental perspective. It's not sustainable from a human health perspective. It's not sustainable from an economic perspective. So all of that being said, the models that have been done, and these are done by OECD and by Systemic and another other groups, have looked at what kinds of obligations we would need to have in the treaty and how effective they would be. And all of the models say that we need to have upstream measures. And as I pointed out earlier, upstream, it's easier to control. In terms of producers, there's a limited number of like large scale producers of companies that are making the raw plastics materials. And once we move from that stage into products, there's a huge proliferation. There's like thousands and thousands of companies using thousands of chemicals and products, and it becomes much more complicated. So if we can start to regulate things upstream from a scientific perspective, from a modeling perspective, it makes more sense. That being said, this is a contentious issue in the negotiations. There are countries that do not want to look at this. A lot of these countries do have strong ties to the fossil fuel industry and to petrochem industries and to production. So it's understandable, I mean, just logically, that through their vested interest that they don't want to look at this. There might also be a misunderstanding around how important it is to work upstream and not focus on downstream mechanisms and waste management. And by changing upstream, what we're producing and how we're producing it, we can also make things easier downstream. So we can improve waste management by addressing the problem upstream as well. We might be able to design for better products that are longer lived, that we're moving away from single-use plastics, and we're not always talking about replacing. So yes, sometimes we might need to replace plastics with other materials or alternatives or substitutes, which, as we heard earlier from other speakers, need to be addressed via the same criteria and the same life cycle analyses as the plastics themselves. But sometimes we don't need to replace. Sometimes we just need to go straight to the top of the waste hierarchy and reduce. We need to stop making those products. Maybe we're going to need to develop new systems and infrastructures and technologies that allow us to live in a more circular system that is not requiring as much extraction and production. So it's sort of complicated. But moving into Busan and addressing production is difficult. There are going to be a number of meetings with the heads of delegations leading up to Busan, where they hopefully will be able to come to more agreement around this, because there is a limited number of hours on the ground of Busan. I think it's 63 hours to negotiate the text, and that will be very difficult. So I'm hoping that there will be more support for looking at production and more consensus across all of the groups of countries where there is, to a certain degree, disagreement around priorities, and that we can understand the need to stop production to reduce the amounts that we're making for all of the reasons I've already stated.
Thank you so much for this clarity. Thank you. And with that note, because it's too much time that our webinar has taken on this aspects, and thank you to all our speakers for sharing their valuable insights. Thank you to our attendees for your active participation. And but before we officially close, we would love to have and capture this moment. And so let's have a quick photo session. So I'd like to, could you please, everyone, including our panelists, to turn on your cameras, and then on the count of 3, we will take a group screenshot.
If I just leave the meeting since she's not doing anything.
Yeah, probably better.
Yeah. Okay. Now with this charming faces, now it's time to take a group screenshot. Say 1, 2, 3, cheese. One, two, three, one more. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And have a good day, good night from somewhere else. from wherever you are. See you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.